Art Asylum Borg assimilation figures, I thought it would be fun to look at the Borg figure from Diamond Select Toys that came just a few years later. By this point, Diamond Select Toys had the license to Star Trek figures, but they weren't really doing too much with it. They'd experimented with different types of figures. They'd released a handful of 7-inch scale figures that were more akin to the early Marvel Selects or even the McFarlane toys of the 90s, which were more focused on hyper detail rather than articulation. And these figures would often be in a particular pose and come with a pretty sizable diorama piece. And at some point I will cover those figures in another video, but suffice it to say they were relatively short-lived, and they began experiments once again with fully articulated action figures. And as part of this lineup they released a Borg and then 2 figures based on the new J.J. Abrams universe version of Star Trek. Sadly, this new line of toys would not go beyond 3 action figures. And so today I'm going to focus on this Borg figure. So then, starting with the packaging, we do have that standard oversized clamshell packaging which Diamond Select Toys is famous for. Now in the case of the Borg, it does seem to be a little bit too big for the figure itself because he doesn't come with a diorama piece, but he does have quite a few accessories. Now in terms of the overall branding and look of this packaging, I don't think it's the most attractive in the world. This was the standard Star Trek packaging at this time, and we do see it appear again and again, even on Mega Toys and other merchandising. And to me, it's a little bit uninspired, it's a little bit bland, a little bit boring, and it doesn't really scream Star Trek to me. So we have the colours red, white and blue. And on the side panel we have a big image of the portrait of Captain Picard, and this feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity because I think we could have had some very nice artwork here, either taken from an illustration in a comic book, it could have been a completely new image, or it could have been an image from the TV show or from First Contact, and I think it would have made the packaging a lot more attractive, would have made it a lot more displayable. And likewise, the reverse of the packaging also leaves a little bit to be desired. We do have a nice big photograph image of the action figure itself front and centre, which is cool, and we can also see a smaller one of some of the different looks you can achieve with some of the accessories, which is quite nicely done. And there's a little bit of bio about the Borg, which is cool, but otherwise, again, the branding, it just doesn't feel quite right for the Borg. That big bright blue and the white background doesn't really capture the spirit or the character of the Borg. Now, I have to say, first impressions getting the figure out of the packaging is a little bit underwhelming. And I think that has something to do with the overall colour palette of the figure is a little bit dull with those blacks and greys, and it doesn't have as much technical detail as you might expect. All that being said, I actually do think on retrospect, this is probably one of the closest or the most authentic Borg figures we have. This figure very clearly is taking its inspiration from First Contact, and I do believe it's modelled on a couple of Borgs that we see in that film. I do really like this head sculpt. I think the colouring and texturing is pretty much perfect, really. It is what we see in the film. The only criticism I have is that there's a little bit too much pink on that bottom lip there, but otherwise the sculpt and the colouring, the paint apps are very nice. There's multiple washes running through this to give it that really pallid sort of grey zombie-like appearance to the flesh, which is great. And I think it's also interesting that clearly this is meant to be a Klingon. We can see the ridges on the head there and the wrinkles in the nose. And there's good effort to have multiple wires looping round from one part of the head to the other, which I think makes it look appropriately cybernetic and quite cool. Now, my initial disappointment was due to the fact that I didn't feel like there was enough wiring, enough technology visible in the moulding and the sculpt of this figure to make it feel authentically like a Borg. However, on closer inspection and looking at some photographs from the film First Contact, I actually do believe this is actually a pretty authentic sculpt. There's actually not an awful lot of wiring and tubing and lots of technical detail on those costumes if you look very carefully. A lot of it is this padding, but it's very cleverly lit so that it looks very threatening in certain lights, and it feels and looks as if it has a lot more technical detail to it than is actually on display. And I think this figure's really fallen victim to that because obviously it doesn't have the benefit of lighting and special camera angles to make it look a certain way. And so in effect what we're seeing is this figure under the microscope. We're seeing it in the cold light of day, which isn't as favourable, and so it looks a little less detailed and feels a little bit more disappointing than maybe it really deserves. Because there is a fair amount of detail running through this figure, they haven't scrimped when it comes to the sculpt, and the paint apps are very nicely applied. So let's take a look at the articulation. He has a ball joint in the neck, which means he can spin his head right the way around if you want him to, and he can look up and down a pretty fair distance too. So there's a pretty fantastic range of motion on display here. Now this is supported with a ball joint in the shoulder and allows the arm to kick up. Now it does meet a bit of resistance in the top of that shoulder pad there, which does stop it from arcing up any further than this, but it's still fairly decent space. This is supported with a pin swivel at the elbow, so the lower arm can spin right the way around, and of course it hinges to about 90 degrees. There's another pin swivel at the wrist, so again the hand can rotate 360 degrees, but it can also hinge forwards and backwards as well. And then there is another ball joint in the upper chest as well, allowing the upper torso to move from side to side, to arc left and right, and of course move forwards and backwards. And then there is a swivel at the waist as well to really allow the figure to really rotate from side to side. There's also a hinge in the hips allowing the legs to kick out to the side, and this is supported by an upper thigh swivel as well. Now the legs can kick forwards, they can't really kick back too far, but there's a decent enough range of motion here, which is supported of course by a double jointed knee. And then finally there is a ball joint at the ankle as well, allowing the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also pivot from side to side. Now sadly, the figure doesn't come with any diorama pieces, however he does come with a ton of extras, including an extra head, multiple versions of eye props that can screw into the eyes to create all sorts of different eye effects and eye pieces, an alternative chest piece which just slides over the torso, and 2 alternative Borg arms which have unknown instruments attached to them. Now all this is very welcome indeed, and it's quite experimental and a really fun idea, because what we have here is the opportunity to create endless different looks for our Borg, and if we really want, we have an opportunity here to buy multiple versions of this figure and create a Borg army, each one looking a little bit different than the other. Between the 2 head sculpts, I have to say I think this one is actually my preference. This one I believe is actually an assimilated Bolian, which is doubly cool because I don't believe we've ever had a Bolian in a 7-inch scale before. And as you can see, the head sculpt really comes alive when you start messing about with some of the extra eye pieces that you can plug into the face, and they just slot in very easily, and they manage to hold their place pretty firmly, and they look pretty cool. Again, nicely sculpted and well painted, and very, very effective, and it definitely adds an extra layer, another dimension to this figure, which makes it look a lot more menacing, and obviously it creates endless opportunities for variance, and it looks pretty good. Now the alternative chest piece just slides on nice and easily and just kind of clips into place. However, there is a tendency for it to want to ride up, or at least on mine that is there, so it never really feels like it's snug to the body, and it does look a little bit loose, and yeah, the paint on it looks a little bit incongruous. It's a little bit lighter than the rest of the figure. That said, it does sort of blend more seamlessly onto the back of the figure and looks pretty decent here. And when we swap the arms out, this really creates the full effect, I think, of the Borg, and certainly what I think of the Borg. So it definitely adds an extra dimension to this figure. He feels a lot more creepy, a lot more unsettling when you start playing around with some of these accessories. And these gun arms are very nicely sculpted. There's a nice paint job running through them as well, multiple washes here, and some of the key points are definitely highlighted with different paints. We can see silver and gold, and they look pretty nicely done. And as I said, pretty authentic to what we see in the film or even the TV show. Now, something else that initially bothered me about this figure is the fact that he doesn't scale very nicely with the Art Asylum Star Trek Next Generation figures. So here we have him next to Riker, and I must admit Riker is one of the taller in that line. However, you can see there's a clear height discrepancy between them, where Riker does seem to tower above this Borg quite dramatically. Now, this shouldn't really matter because Borgs come in all shapes and sizes, so height really isn't an issue. And yet, it does bother me because I do feel that any of the villains, any of the sort of monsters or monstrous aliens that we have in the show should sort of tower above the heroes, or at least be on an equal footing with them. As it is, this doesn't look like they're meant to be part of the same set, which of course they're not, but it would have been nice if he'd just been scaled up a little bit taller. And when we put him next to one of the Art Asylum Borgs from that Borg assimilation wave I looked at last week, you can see again, he just is nowhere near the height of those figures, because those figures were much taller than the Next Generation figures that they supported. So definitely this looks really incongruous. It actually highlights even more the exaggerated effect of those Art Asylum figures with their hyper detailed armour and maybe a little bit too much technical detail. Now, I have to say, when I originally bought this figure, I unpackaged him, felt a little bit disappointed, put him back in his packaging, and I haven't seen him for several years. Getting him out of his case again and revisiting it for this review, I have to say, I feel like I was overly harsh and misjudged this figure first time around. There's actually lots of things about this figure that I think are quite superior to what we see in the Art Asylum run. His dimensions and proportions are much better. He's actually much more accurate to what we see on screen, and I think the fact that he comes with all these different accessories makes him really fun and diverse and interesting. And as I said, the potential to create an army from just 2 or 3 figures using these bits and pieces speaks volumes about how fun this figure actually is. And in truth, I can't really hold it against this figure that he doesn't fit into scale with some of the next generation figures that have come before, because this is obviously a new breed of figure, and I think was intended to launch a new gateway to re-exploring some of those characters. And I think if we had them in this scale from this particular line, then these would have measured up very, very nicely. And in a way, it's a real shame that this line didn't continue, because this board kind of feels a bit lonely, a bit out of place with the rest of my collection, and he doesn't really feel like he belongs to a particular collection. He's kind of unique and on his own. Now, on that note, I do want to say thank you to Ken Marsh for his suggestion to look at the Borg figures across the years and see how they compare as a collection in their own right. I think that's a really great idea, definitely something I will get around to doing at some point soon. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.